to the NPTEL online certification course Tribal Studies in India, Interdisciplinary Perspectives and Approaches. Today we will be doing our lecture number 46 titled Social Exclusion and Socio-Economic Status of Tribes in the Post-Reform Era. And in this lecture there is a lot to say about the question of exclusion conceptually and empirically, and in this lecture we will be primarily focused on the question of exclusion that happens primarily due to the kind of development interventions in India, particularly in the post-independent period. Now, the concept of social exclusion has been in circulation for some time now, and the term exclusion has been used differently, but social exclusion as a concept is more recent, in a sense that it became to be popularized when it was used in the European context, particularly in France, and when it was used in the European context, it was mostly used to refer to communities who are living at the margins of society. But social exclusion as a term is a very broad, it's a very loose term, in a sense that many a times there is no clear definition, there is no clear understanding of what we mean by social exclusion. And exclusion also can happen at the level of individual, at the level of group, and at the level of community. But today for this lecture, despite these conceptual difficulties in terms of defining what constitutes social exclusion or exclusion, we are mostly concerned about exclusion as experienced at the level of the community. So, we are basically talking about social exclusion in relation to tribal communities. Now, let us quickly run through a very basic understanding of tribes, tribal communities, and then we will move, because this is important again, because it helps us to really situate the kind of the process of exclusion that happen, and it helps us to foreground the kind of issues that tribal communities are facing. So, a very simplistic definition or understanding of tribes is that they are mostly understood as communities who lives in geographical and social isolation from the larger Indian society. And even if you look at the criteria for defining tribes officially or administratively, one of the most important or one of the criteria is that the communities are living in geographical isolation. So, geographical isolation or isolation of tribal communities or tribal communities as living in remote inaccessible terrain is something which is very strong even in the consciousness of many non-tribal communities. So, the moment the term tribe is being used, the first thing that comes to mind is that they are living in geographically isolated spaces or regions, and mostly they enjoy autonomy of governance over the territory they occupy. They held control over the land, the forests and other resources, and govern themselves in terms of their own laws, traditions and customs, or sometimes in short what we call customary laws. Now, with the coming of the British rule, things have changed for the communities, and this has deep socio-economic implications in the life of the communities, and it did not stop with the end of the British rule. It continues even in the post-colonial period. Now, with the coming of the British rule, many tribal communities, they were forced by the colonial state and integrated by force through war, conquest and annexation, and this was followed by the introduction of new and uniform civil and criminal laws, as well as the setting up of administrative structures which were totally different or alien to the tribal traditional life. So, the encounter between the colonial state and the tribe was defined by violence. It was a very violent encounter, where on the one hand tribal communities were fiercely opposing and resisting the expansion of the colonial state into the territories. This was also very evident in the context of northeastern part of India. This was very evident in every parts of India where tribal communities live. So, therefore, the encounter between tribes and the colonial state was something that was very violent. And so, with the coming of the colonial state, they began to introduce new laws, they began to introduce new systems of administration, and one of them was that they have introduced the idea of private property and landlordism. And this means that the colonial state introduced new revenue collectors and administrative officials who are converted into owners and landlords. So, the first impact is is evident here, where the communities who were the owners of their land, who were owners of their forest, they become tenants to the collectors or administrative officials who were designated by the colonial state. Now, what is the impact of this process? It resulted into large scale dispossession or eviction of tribes from their land and the installation of non-tribal communities in their place. So, in regions where the communities still have control over their land, massive transfer of land took place from tribes to non-tribes through such measures as fraud, deceit, mortgage, etc. So, one of the most important questions when one talks about tribal communities is the question of land alienation, and this process of land alienation was a process that was initiated by the colonial state. So, the position that tribes began to occupy in the new political administrative system under the colonial state was defined by a steady erosion of their control and access to land, forests and other resources. So, basically what we are seeing is that the expansion of the colonial state into the tribal regions resulted into a kind of exclusion that was an exclusion defined by dispossession, an exclusion defined by deprivation, which further or which in turn resulted into poverty, pauperization, immerserization in the tribal communities. And when one talks about exclusion, economic exclusion is a very important part, and there are social exclusion also, there are economic exclusion, there are political exclusions, and these three exclusions cannot be understood in isolation from one another. Now, what the colonial state essentially did to the tribal communities was dispossessing from their resources, and this resulted into tribes being excluded from the process of development, or development in turn resulting or creating exclusion. Tribes who used to have control over their land, their forests and other resources, and who enjoyed autonomy of governance, they were pushed to the margins of the new political and economic systems. Now, in the larger socio-economic political systems over a period of time under the colonial state also, what we see is that it resulted into massive dispossession, it resulted into massive relocation, by which the communities were pushed to the margins of the society. So, the process of integrating tribal communities into the larger colonial state was defined by exclusion. So, there was on the one hand inclusion of the communities into the larger colonial state, and this process of inclusion ironically was intertwined with the process of exclusion in the form of loss of access and control over livelihood, that is basically economic rights, as well as control over decision making process in the determination of their own life. Now, the loss of autonomy in terms of their resources, the loss of autonomy in terms of their political institutions have a deep implications in terms of the kind of life that the communities wanted to live and the communities wanted to enjoy. So, in that sense the inclusion of tribal communities into the larger colonial state resulted into them being excluded, by virtue of which they were dispossessed from their resources, they lost control over their access to their resources, their livelihood, and finally also in terms of losing their autonomy or decision making power in the determination of their life. So, what about in the context of the post-colonial state? So, despite the communities being included into the larger political and economic system, integration or inclusion was far from complete. So, definitely there is no question about the communities being integrated politically or administratively integrated, but this process of integration also resulted into a lot of exclusion as well. So, to ensure that integration and thus build an inclusive society, tribals were given the same rights and status as to those accorded as members of the larger Indian society. So, everyone in India, by virtue of being born in this country, all of us have citizenship rights, and when we have citizenship rights, we have fundamental rights, certain fundamental rights that cannot be taken away from us. We also have citizenship rights that includes civil, political and social rights. So, everyone irrespective of our background, whether our culture, whether our language, whether our religion, whether our region, whether we come from different parts of the country, it does not matter. By virtue of being an Indian, all of us have equal rights. Now, out of all these rights, the most vulnerable as far as tribes are concerned is property and justice under the civil rights category. Now, why is this so? The right to property of one, mostly of non-tribals, has been the right to dispossession of property by another, mostly of the tribals. Now, in the case of one important rights that we have as a human, as a citizen of this country is right to property, in the sense that we have the right to own a property. But then this right to property has in some sense resulted or granted the right to dispossess tribal communities from the kind of resources or property that they have. So, tribes along with Dalits were given certain special rights which the other citizens were not entitled to. All of us know that if you look at the constitution, there are a lot of special provisions, there are a lot of special concessions that were granted to the communities belonging to the scheduled tribes and scheduled castes, and these special rights granted to them were meant to compensate for the kind of historical injustice that they suffer for centuries either due to systemic discrimination or historical injustice in the case of tribes, and ensure that all of these communities also get equal chances and opportunities and also enjoy the citizenship rights which are enshrined in the constitutions. Now, these laws, they are meant to protect, and therefore they are protective in the sense that they are aimed at safeguarding the interests of the tribal people. These rights were aimed at providing them a certain share of participation in state institutions, for which there are reservations or quotas which are being designated for these communities in state institutions, such as at the level of parliament, at the level of state legislature, governments and institutions of higher learning. For example, we have 7.5% reservation for tribal communities when it comes to employment, and there are also specific seats which are reserved at the parliamentary level, at the state level as well. So, to ensure that they get fair chances, they get opportunities, and they do not feel excluded, or they are not excluded from the larger national processes of development. So, the special treatment, most of the time we call it affirmative action programs, and these affirmative action programs comes in various forms and various designs. There can be affirmative action programs in terms of quotas, there can be affirmative action policies in terms of providing special economic benefits or special or different economic support. There can also be affirmative action programs in terms of designing specific policies to economically uplift the communities. So, the kind of special treatment that is granted to certain categories of people such as tribes in this context is to also protect their welfare and interests and promote their development. And affirmative action programs in particular in the context of India also primarily aim to address the issues that disadvantaged groups face. In the context of tribal communities, definitely they are quite disadvantaged in terms of their socio-economic conditions even till today. And like I said, one very important intervention which is being made by the government of India is by providing reservation of quota for the disadvantaged groups in different sectors, particularly in the government sector. So, various interventions have been in effect, but reservation policy has drawn the most attention and debate. It is something which is very debatable, and it has been debated, and when the idea of having reservation was conceived, the plan was that it should be withdrawn after 10 years, but then till today, after 70 years of India's independence, we continue to have this system, and this is something which is a very debatable thing, but as of now the intention was that to bring to give opportunities and to give fair chance to the communities. So, tribes have definitely it is not to say that they have not taken benefit of these provisions, but definitely they have taken benefit of these positions, and today you will see that the communities are getting represented at various levels of government services in different categories in different parts of the country. However, the other side of this is also that there are a lot of backlogs, there are a lot of they are still very much underrepresented in different sectors. This is not to say that the policies are not working, but then it is not always that the kind of provisions that are being laid out for the communities are being are ensured that the communities get the benefit of this. There are also schemes like post-matric scholarship, book bank and upgradation of merit which have been introduced, and in addition to this there are also development initiatives and special multi-purpose development projects as supplements to the community development projects which were introduced in tribal areas. Accordingly, the community development program approach was reoriented, keeping in mind the special problems of the tribal people. Since the previous approach failed to serve the interests of the community, a new approach in the form of tribal sub-plan was adopted in the 5th five-year plan, which continues to this day. Now, like I said, affirmative action policies does not come in one basket or one approach. We have, for example, the constitutional provisions in terms of reservations. We also have constitutional provisions in terms of political autonomy that we have already talked about in the previous classes, such as primarily by looking at the 5th schedule and the 6th schedules. And today we are talking about the constitutional provisions in terms of development. And a very important feature that the government of India has done is by introducing something known as the tribal sub-plan within the 5-year plans. Now, the tribal sub-plan essentially is also, it also means that a specific amount of money, a specific budget, a budgetary allocation is made specifically for the tribal communities in India, that is known by the name tribal sub-plan. Now, this tribal sub-plan, it focuses on the area development by aiming to improve the quality of life, and its main components were the integrated tribal development project, the modified area development approach, and pockets and primitive tribal group projects. Now, By now we already know that tribes are not the category tribes or scheduled tribe is a very heterogeneous category, and many times it is also difficult because today if you look at the condition of tribal communities, they are at different levels of development. Some tribal communities are still very much in a difficult situation, whereas some tribal communities have come up very well and do very well in terms of their socio-cultural economic condition. So, therefore, we cannot have a single approach when we deal with the tribal communities. So, within the kind of programs and policies that are being constituted for the communities, you will see that there is again a breakdown of these according to the needs, according to the target groups, or according to the intended beneficiaries. So, under the TSP, that is the tribal sub-plan, several schemes have been introduced, and this includes schemes like residential schools, vocational education, scholarships, book grants, free uniforms, midday meals, etc. And apart from this, there are also a strong emphasis which are being made on extending and improving health infrastructure such as PHC, CHC, etc., as well as prevention and control of communicable and non-communicable diseases. Now, many of these schemes under health and education also primarily gives a lot of importance to women and children. Now, in case of economic development, there are important schemes that include the integrated tribal development projects, employment guarantee scheme, food for work program, employment assurance scheme, Jawahar Rozgar Yojana, Sampurna Gramin Rozgar Yojana, and Swan Jayanti Gram Swarozgar Yojana. So, all these policies have significantly contributed to the tribal population. The tragedy remains that the level of poverty among tribal communities is still very high, and today this is one of the most serious issues or concern when it comes to poverty discourse in India. So, this is where I wanted to come in. Essentially, when we talk about exclusion of tribal communities, is that despite the fact that tribes constitute only 8.5% of India's population, their contributions in terms of poverty, their contributions in terms of illiteracy, malnutrition, so on and so forth is very high. So, by which the government of India also realized that special policies, special programs need to be designed specifically for these communities because their needs are different, the kind of challenges they have are also different. And today if you look at the statistics also, you will see that there are a lot of communities, particularly tribal communities in the states like Odisha, in MP and all, who have who are living still in a very difficult condition, and one of the primary reason of this is the prevalence of extreme poverty. Now, several factors are responsible for this. First is the resources earmarked for tribal development, though undergone increase, had been far from adequate. So, basically the budgetary allocation remains low or inadequate. Second is the ineffective implementation of programs. Now, we just talk about the different kind of programs and policies that are there, the different kind of constitutional provisions that are there, but the challenge remains that there is still a lot of gaps, there is still a lot of loopholes when it comes to the implementation of such programs. The third factor is that the traditional socio-cultural aspects of tribal life, that is tribal communities suffer from low income and poor educational and health status, as well as various kinds of diseases. They are often attributed to their tradition and style of life. So, certain aspects of their own traditional culture or traditional structure may also contribute in terms of their developmental exclusion, but by and large the issue is that the larger society, there is a tendency even till today to view tribes as alien to their society, and then we see that there is overall indifference towards their cause and development. Basically, the kind of political commitment, the kind of seriousness or commitment that demands to economically uplift these communities have not been there. So, which resulted into this vicious cycle of poverty among large section of tribal communities. So, the problem therefore is not so much about the failure to push development programs in tribal areas, but due to the inadequate resources or ineffective implementation or even tribal tradition and social structure, but the larger question of development in the form of large scale development projects such as dams, irrigation, power plants, roads, railways, industry and mineral exploitation. So, the problem is not necessarily that there is no development that is happening. The problem is not necessarily that there is very less money dedicated for the communities. The problem is not always about that tribal communities or their culture are blocking or are acting as a hinder to development. The larger issue is also that many of the development interventions that are being undertaken in the post-colonial period essentially have actually resulted in the deprivation and dispossession of these communities from their natural resources, and this has been one of the major factor or the major challenges when one talks about development and exclusion in the context of tribes. Now, these projects that we just talked about, it resulted into the appropriation of tribal lands, forests and other resources that began under the colonial rule and continued into the post-independence period. Except in the post-independence period, these are justified as development for national and regional. These development interventions, they proved to be detrimental to the interests of the tribal communities, and in the process it affects their access to affirmative action program as well. So, on one hand, we are creating these policies which essentially deprive them of their natural resources, their natural habitats, by which they are not in a position to even enjoy the kind of provisions, the kind of special treatments that are being granted or that are being enshrined in the Constitution of India. So, without any fault of their own, they are steadily pushed away from their land, from their forests and other resources due to state sponsored projects of national development on the one side and alienation of land from tribal to non-tribals on the other. So, over the last 60 to 70 years, tribal communities underwent change not only in terms of their relationship with land, but also in terms of their relationship with forests. As long as tribes are in control of the forests in the sense of unrestricted use of forest resources, they had little difficulty meeting their needs. Most of the time, if you look at tribal society, it is not to romanticize them, but you will see that they continue to practice a very subsistence way of life. And there are many communities in India are still very much dependent on forest resources. And in the last lectures, one of my lectures I have said that at least 70 to 75% of India's tribal population, they are dependent directly or indirectly on forest resources. Now, the moment that they are being deprived of access to forest resources, it results into economic immiserization, it results into economic pauperization. Now, this deprivation actually exclude them from the larger development processes that is taking place. So, one is that definitely the entry of the colonial state, which drastically altered the relationship between the communities and the forests. The policy pursued by the colonial state unfortunately is continued in the post-independence period, where economic development even with stricter rules and regulations were being introduced, by virtue of which we continue to see these communities, tribal communities, being dispossessed from their land, dispossessed from their from forest resources, and these have had very, very serious implications in terms of their access to basic necessities of life, such as food, shelter for the communities. Now, we have talked enough about dispossession, we have talked enough about deprivation, we have talked enough about uprootedness. Now, when a community is being uprooted, particularly for a community like tribes, where the social organization is largely around kinship and clans, being uprooted, being dispossessed also means that the community social bonding is also disintegrating. Now, for communities, for many tribal communities, the community bonding is very important. It is a kind of social security, because everyone lives together and everyone knows each other. So, most of the time they also support each other in times of their needs, in times of their troubles. Now, when a community is being dispossessed, being uprooted, it also means that they are being deprived of the kind of social community capital that they used to have. So, the breakdown, so it resulted in the breakdown of the community, which becomes very difficult for the communities to readjust themselves, which becomes very difficult for them to adjust to the new way of life. So, large scale development projects and policies of denied them access to forest resources, and at the same time affirmative action programs which are developed for the welfare of the tribal people also in many instances have not reached to the communities. Now, there are also arguments like that affirmative action in the case of tribes tend to be no longer affirmative action, as it does not tend to uplift them from the given social base in which they were traditionally located. Rather, they were pushed through alongside the processes that further deteriorate their existing social base and further expose their vulnerability. Now, in many sense, for many communities, many tribal communities are yet to actually, like I said, get the benefits of constitutional provisions which are enshrined in the Constitution of India. Now, many times what many scholars have also observed is that this kind of provisions are not only working, but also many times pushing them towards the margins of society. Unless this is corrected, development will continue to perpetuate social exclusion among tribals. Now, so by and large, through this lecture, what I essentially wanted to talk about is only one specific dimension of exclusion that has taken place among tribal communities, and it is important because if you trace back the history of dispossession, the history of development in post-independent India, you will see that there is a lot of displacement that has happened, and one of the communities who have faced this at a very enormous scale is the tribal communities. Now, which also means that over the last 50 to 60 years, you will see that the communities have been continually displaced and dispossessed, and over a period of time they are being gradually pushed to the margins of the society. So, the marginalization or the marginal condition of tribal communities is not of their own creation, but it has happened with starting from the colonial period, when the colonial state began to introduce new regimes of property, new regimes of rule pertaining to the governing of forests, to the governing of water, and new regimes of property in terms of land ownership, in terms of the way in which economic relations are organized. So, by and large, over a period of time in the post-colonial period, that process of dispossessing tribals continue in many ways. And while there are a lot of several constitutional provisions that are being specifically designed for the tribal communities, we still have a long way to go in terms of really integrating the tribal communities, because they continue to face a lot of difficulties, particularly in terms of socio-economic development. And today's lecture is primarily taken again from the work of Professor Virginus Kaka, Tribes and Social Exclusion. And by and large, I think it is a very important question when it comes, the question of exclusion is very important, particularly in the context of tribes. And even in contemporary India, it continued to resonate deeply in a context, where we continue to see that, the communities continue to live at the margins of Indian society. With this, I end my lecture. Thank you so much.